It's game 2 of the FIDE World Chess Championship match in Singapore. And what an explosive start we had yesterday as world champion Ding Liren won in very impressive style against the challenger Gukesh. An absolute must watch for you guys if you haven't seen yet. Now on day 2, Gukesh is playing with the black pieces and the question is he able to recover quickly from that painful defeat? Ding Liren taking the lead 1-0, but still 13 more games to go. So many things can still happen. Maybe for Gukesh it's more important to stop the bleeding and try to get into the match. Now, Ding Liren opens game 2 with the move 1e4 and Gukesh played e5. So he's playing solid chess so far. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. It's the Italian opening. And Gukesh goes for the move bishop c5. Still, we can have a lot of sharp lines. But nowadays, at the highest level, people prefer to play the gioco piano, the slow Italian game with the move d3. Knight f6, black continues developing. And very often, well, this move c3 is going to be played with a lot of flexible play for both sides. Maybe white is going to expand with b4, maybe expand in the center at some point. Here, Ding drops the first surprise as he played the move knight c3. A very logical developing move, and it's maybe a move you have even played yourself. I mean, also beginners should play in such a way, right? Like you occupy the center with a pawn, you develop your minor pieces, complete your opening by developing all your pieces as quickly as possible. But it does take away a bit of your flexibility. You're no longer able to contest the center with the move c3 and d4. Well, anyway, this is a very well-known line. Gukesh has even played it himself against Magnus Carlsen back in 2022. Now he's playing with the black pieces, goes for the move a6. Very typical move in the Italian opening, as whenever the bishop comes under attack, it can drop back to a7. White played here the move a4, expanding on the queen side, preventing black ever from playing the move b7, b5, if that is going to be an issue. Black played here the move d6. And white continues with castling kingside. And black played here the move h6. So that idea is to cover the g5 square, preventing white from ever playing bishop g5 and attack the knight on f6. So that is very well-known stuff. But here white comes up with a different plan. He's not going to develop the bishop to g5 any longer, but puts it on e3. And now we have been talking about these kind of positions quite often, as black, of course, has the possibility here to take on e3, giving white double pawns in the center. But thanks to the half-open f-file, there are clear ideas here for white to play for some sort of kingside attack with moves like queen e1. Swing the queen over to the king side, maybe knight h4, knight f5, a lot of ideas. And I think in general, these positions are somewhat more pleasant to play for white. Probably Ding has the same opinion, and therefore Gukesh decided not to take on e3, but played here the move bishop e6. So it's an almost symmetrical structure. Here, big tension in the center. Who's going to take first? Well, here Ding came up with a new idea. I mean, there are not that many games with this exact position, but he played a move a4, a5. Remarkable idea, giving black the chance here to decide what structure he's going to aim for. The point of this move a5 is quite deep. There are possible ideas to activate a rook later on, perhaps to a4. Grabbing space is quite valuable in a lot of positions. We will see what happens. So here, Gukesh is the first one to capture a piece. He decided to take on c4. Whereas, I mean, there were other options. He could have maintained the tension here by castling kingside. That looks quite reasonable. Taking on e3, as I mentioned earlier, is also absolutely playable. But he decides to take on c4. Bishop takes c4. White takes back with the pawn. Now double pawns on the c-file. And, well, interesting moment. What is going to happen with that second pair of bishops? Is white going to take? Is black going to take? Well, if black is going to take on e3, which was not played in the game, white even gets isolated double pawns on the e-file. But a good note for him is that black is not really able to attack these pawns. And well, the half-open d-file may also be quite useful for white. Like there are definitely ideas to use the d5 square jumping in there with your knight. You may use the half-open f-file as well with ideas like knight h4, knight f5, as I mentioned earlier. So I don't think that the double pawns are really bad in that case. And well, whenever you have double pawns, you have open files, half-open files in this case. So that is, in a way, it's easier for white to use the major pieces than it is for black. Now, back to the game. Instead of taking on e3, Gukesh castled here. And so it's clear that he doesn't really want to take on e3 anytime himself. But that gives Ding the chance still to take on c5. Bishop takes c5, d takes c5 with a symmetrical structure. One open file. And likely the queens are coming off the board at some point and maybe more pieces can be exchanged as well. Now with that pawn on a5, on one hand white got to retain control over that pawn with the rook because the pawn is targeted by the knight on c6. But at some point white also does have ideas perhaps to attack the pawn on c5, which cannot easily be defended with the move b7, b6. So there are some ideas by placing that pawn on a5. And well, Gukesh definitely being caught by surprise, was down on the clock, spent more than half an hour, and Ding looked pretty comfortable here. Played the move b3, supporting the pawn on c4 even a bit better, consolidating the pawn structure. And what is going to happen? Is black going to exchange queens? If you don't do that, if you play something like queen e7, then you got to reckon with ideas like knight d5. And this knight on d5 is quite annoying. Like you have ideas of recapturing, improving the pawn structure, probably even take back with the pawn, with the e pawn, so that you can put a rook on e1. Things are looking quite a bit unpleasant for black. So instead, Gukesh said, well, let's swap queens. Queen takes d1, rook f takes d1. As I said, the rook stays on the a file to keep the pawn defended. And rook a d8. So what's going to happen in this symmetrical structure? I mean, there are quite still some ideas to play for. And the position is much more tricky than a lot of people would think. However, the next move by Ding really caught me by surprise, as he decided to leave the open file, sidestep the d file by playing the move rook dc1. In hindsight, I tend to think that something like knight e1, getting the knight over straight away to d3 to close the d file and target the pawn weaknesses on c5 and e5, that looks more challenging to me. After the rook dc1, looks like black should be quite comfortable, as he played here the move knight d4, Gukesh. It's a very logical move. I mean, white should not take on d4 because it helps black to undouble the pawns, attack the knight on c3, and after the knight goes away, the pawn on e4 can be taken. And well, the alternative is to take the pawn on e5. That pawn is unprotected all of a sudden. But, well, this was also not played because of rook f e8, and if the knight goes away, the pawn on e4 is hanging. You may still support that knight on e5 with something like f4, but the tactics are working in black's favor. Look at this, knight takes e4. If you do take the knight, well, there's knight e2 check, and after king f1, rather than taking the rook, you can just play something like knight takes f4, and knights hanging on the e-file means that black is going to regain the piece. Things are looking quite okay for black in all these lines. So instead of taking on d4, look what Ding played. He dropped back with a knight to e1. So still he is going to get in that move knight d3 at some point. Black played rook d6, but you have to be very careful. If you do play knight d3 here, well, there is this little tactic with knight takes b3. Black is winning a pawn as by moving the knight away from the d-file, the knight on d3 is under pressure. If you do take the knight on b3, it's rook takes d3, and black is up a pawn. So knight e3 at this point is not a good idea. White instead played king f1, bringing the king closer to the center, enabling the knight from c3 to move, so that you don't have to reckon with knight forks like knight e2 forking the king on g1. That's why king f1 is played. Black played g6. trying to slowly improve the position. And now remarkable play. I mean, the rook goes back to d1. So what is the main point of white's play? Why do you go first to c1 and then back to d1? Well, I think the point is that the knight is not on c6. I mean, in the other lines with the open d file, the rooks contesting each other, the knight on c6 means that you have to retain control over the pawn on a5. And now with the knight on d4, I mean, the knight on d4 is standing nicely there, but it cannot really come forward. There are no threats. Pawn on a5 is not in trouble. Black played rook fd8, and white went here for the move f3, overprotecting the pawn on e4. Black played king g7, and white puts the king on f2. Looks like a solid move. You may think, why didn't white play immediately f3 so that the king could have gone right away to f2? I think it's actually a very fair question, and it definitely makes sense to at least to have considered playing in such a way. Instead, well, white played in this way and everything is still under control. And well, at some point, white will definitely think about ideas to target the pawns on c5 and e5. Well, black played h5. Maybe the idea is to prevent white from expanding on the king side with a move like g4. I'm not sure if that was really on Ding's mind, but that might explain Gukesh's move. And it looks like everything is still quite okay here. What should white do? I think a move like h4 also comes into consideration to prevent black from further expanding. And well, very soon white has to come up with plans like play knight e5 maybe, to maybe go rook b1 and try to push b4, maybe prepare it with something like c3. It's hard to say. It's very complicated position. But at this point, Ding decided to play the move knight e2, and I think he's trying to set some sort of a little trap here at this point. I mean, you may take on e2 and swap the knights, but basically you trade off black's best piece in that case. And in such cases, when everything is coming off the board, black can even take back with a pawn. Position does look very, very even. I think Gukesh's move also does make sense. He, instead of taking on e2, he just dropped back with a knight to c6, and then all of a sudden you do see this pressure along the d-file with the knight on c6 targeting the pawn on a5, and that is maybe something you don't really like here as white. So here Ding decided to go back with the knight to c3, keeping this rook defended. And this is actually a little trap what I was referring to. Black is not able to come in with his rook to the second rank with rook d2 check. If you do swap the rooks and put a king on e3, look at that knight on e1. It's nicely protecting the pawns. Rook will have to go back to d8 at some point, and then you have knight e5. And I think white is making progress here, serious progress, as pawn on c7 is vulnerable. And well, very soon the knight will come to d3, pawns on c5 and e5. Well, if white gets this position, it's a dream coming true. This is like the most you can get out of your position as white. But black is not forced here to go rook d2. And even if you do take on d1, you have to be careful. If you do take with a rook on d1, then rooks are coming off the board, and then the pawn on a5 is hanging. So in this case, you would have to take with the knight. But I think white is okay exchanging one pair of rooks. And very soon, as I mentioned earlier, the knights are coming back and are able to target these pawn weaknesses. And an important trick here is that after knight takes a5, black is not really going to win a pawn. You do take a pawn, white captures the knight, you can take with the rook on d1, but at the end there is rook takes c5, regaining the pawn and creating a double attack against pawn on e5 and the pawn on c7. So here white is definitely better. But getting back to this position, rather than exchanging one pair of rooks, Gukesh played here the move knight d4. So he's keeping both rooks on the board and also his strongest piece. The knight on d4 is kind of an annoying piece targeting the pawn on c2, which means that the knight from e1 cannot easily move. And well, Ding said, I'm playing here knight e2, knight c6, knight c3, knight e4, and the players ended here the game with a repetition of moves. A draw was agreed on move 23. So that's a relatively calm follow-up of that very wild game in round one. I think both players are relatively satisfied with this particular game. Ding consolidating his lead after this wild victory with the black pieces. He is fine, just trying to get rid of as many games as possible, and he basically gave up this white game. Like maybe he wanted to try something little, but he accepted that he basically didn't achieve much. So draw is fine with him. From Gukesh perspective, he is also quite satisfied to stop the bleeding and finally score his first half a point in this match. So good start for Ding. It's 1.5 for the reigning world champion. 12 more games to go. Anything can happen, of course. I'm very curious to see what's going to happen tomorrow. I hope you do like the coverage of this World Championship match. And if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, don't forget to do that. Also, you can like this video. You can make PayPal donations to support the channel. And, well, of course, we get 7,000 subscribers and way more. So please help to grow the channel. And I will cover all the highlights of this fascinating World Championship match. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.